Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today I'm really excited to have a special guest on, Belinda Fettke. We're going to be diving into all the history of how Big Pharma and Big Food has ended up in this situation with all this corruption and the push towards certain diets and all these agendas behind the scenes. So Belinda's been doing some amazing research for many years. She's the wife of Gary Fettke, who we've had on the show, and we've had some amazing chats and dinners recently with a whole group of doctors and health professionals that are all starting to wake up. So welcome to the show, Belinda.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
Do you want to give people maybe just sort of the quick version of your history and how you started going down these rabbit holes? And I've spoken about sort of how Gary took on the medical industry and won his license back, starting to talk about all this. But give us your story and your journey.
I think it's a really important place to start. And before we go any further, I'd really love to say I'm not anti-vegan, anti-vegetarian, anti-religion. I'm really respectful. I hope I respect people's beliefs and their individual choices. But as I came to understand, which I'll go through shortly, that this choice was being taken away from people, being taken away from healthcare professionals, being able to advise people, being taken away through guidelines for individuals to include animal protein and fat in their diet for their health. So it's this lack of transparency that I'm trying to call out. So again, it's not about an individual and not about your choices, but it's about having choice. And if it's going to improve someone's health, I believe it's a very important discussion to be having. So how I got to all of this, as you've interviewed Gary previously, I think it was about 2011. He started to question 20 years before, so we're talking nearly 30 years ago now, he might have seen someone who required an amputation or debridement of part of their non-healing flesh as a complication of type 2 diabetes. So it was very, very rare, once or twice a year. And by 2016, in his practice here in northern Tasmania, he was seeing someone every single week who required that sort of debridement. But by 2011, it was definitely starting to hit him that this was starting to become a tsunami of people. Mm-hmm. And what a band-aiding sick care wasn't working, and so he started to question things. He was given a book by David Gillespie, Sweet Poison. Now, David Gillespie's a lawyer, and Gary originally thought, what could a lawyer know about sugar that I don't know? I'm a doctor. And he started to look into it. He read the book. He gave up sugar himself, started to see his own health improvement, and thought, I'm going to take this into my practice. I'm going to help people with type 2 diabetes in particular manage this, improve it, and hopefully, I don't think he even realised he could reverse it. But once he did in about 2012, he was so naive, Alex. He was pretty much saying to me, oh my gosh, in 2 years, Belinda, there'll be no type 2 diabetes. Like, this will be a thing of the past. And I was so proud of him. He was working out the science, which is what healthcare professionals should be looking at, the science. And so looking at anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, it all started to really make sense. And the metabolism of fructose hadn't even been worked out till 2010. So this was very new stuff. And so he was starting to see amazing things with his patients. They were really starting to plateau or even improve. And so he started talking about it in the hospital. He started realizing how much sugar people are being fed. And the diabetic menu at the time included 3 desserts per day. And he's like, whoa, wait a minute, high carb, where's the protein that we need for healing? Where are the healthy fats? We need to eat healthy fats to be able to absorb the essential fatty acids, vitamin A, D, and K2. So this was all starting to hit him at one stage. And so no one was listening at the hospital, or very few people. He started making more and more noise. He said, I would really like my patients who are having these high-carb meals to be able to have the option to reduce that, not to have so much sugar. I'd love to include eggs and cheese and whole full cream milk in their diet if they are interested in it. And still nothing's happening. So he started writing prescriptions in the notes. And I think it came to the notice, obviously, of certain people and certain associations, as we'll go into. And he was reported by a dietitian in his hospital to the medical board for recommending people reduce sugar. By the time he was reported, he was starting to move much more in towards processed carbohydrates as well, and understanding that as soon as you eat a carbohydrate, it becomes glucose, and all the things that you were talking about even earlier, Alex. I remember, Alex, your audience might not be aware, but you went to school with our daughter, and I can remember Kate talking about the things that you were mentioning, and so Gary was lagging behind you. You were a star already out there. But anyway, he was reported to the medical board, and we thought, oh, this is ridiculous. 2014, they're just going to throw this out. They're not going to take this seriously. I mean, he can talk about reducing smoking and he's not a respiratory physician, but he could understand that was restricting extremities, the vessels in extremities, and causing people to have more complications. So he could talk about reducing smoking. He could talk about exercise without being an exercise physiologist. He didn't have specific training, but all of a sudden he wasn't allowed to talk about sugar because that was dietetics. And he was standing on toes he didn't realise at the time. So APRA, the medical board, decided to go ahead with this investigation. And we thought, oh gosh, okay. So Gary started just sending all the information that he knew about sugar, all the information he was starting to uncover about fructose metabolism and everything else. And it just kept going. And the expert witness that was brought in to determine if an orthopaedic surgeon in northern Tasmania could talk about reducing sugar, normally with APRA, it's someone who is sort of a peer. They should have asked someone in Hobart, would you consider doing this if you were looking after someone with type 2 diabetes? But instead, it was the biggest nutrition gun in Southeast Asia Pacific region was called in. Why? Yeah. Gary had about 5,000 people following him on Facebook at the time. Northern Tasmania, we're not a very big area. 120,000 catchment area? It was ridiculous. And so I wrote to this man. I got his email and I wrote to every single email I could find at Monash University, Deakin University, even in Taiwan where he was based as well. And he didn't reply. So as I say to Gary, he pissed me off a little bit because when I worked out that cereal for brekkie was coming after my husband, the mama bear came out, Alex. Yeah. And I was growling. I was like, what? So I worked out that he worked not for the sugar industry, which I was sort of a bit of cognitive dissonance thinking he must work for sugar, but he worked for the cereal industry. And then that sort of made sense as well. And I took a lot of screen grabs. I went back through the Wayback Machine. I'm not very technical, but William was teaching me all these things, our son, going, Mum, look into this and do this. So I did diligently, captured all these information, and we gave it to the medical board and said, excuse me, this man's working for the cereal industry. We think this is a conflict of interest. And APRA came back to us saying, we spoke to this professor, emeritus professor, and he doesn't believe it's a conflict of interest, and we believe him, not you.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
nice.
That got me. So ever since then, 2015, I have been on a deep dive into, I guess, who decides what we eat, when we eat, and why.
Amazing. You've touched on a couple of things there already. And one thing I want to mention is when Gary got that book off the lawyer, I think you said it was, that it's
David Gillespie.
That ego death that we have to go through as someone that also did pharmacy. And I was lucky that I was kind of always into weird and wonderful. And I think for me, I saw a documentary called Reversing Diabetes in 28 Days while I was still at uni. So I was learning both sides at once, which kept me open minds to everything else, including Bitcoin, all these other weird and wonderful stuff we're now into. Yes. But it is that real ego death for doctors. And you've gone through all the training and you've spent the money, and it's almost like your religion, your programming that and you're on a good wage, you don't want to rock the boat. So there's all these things that keep people locked into the system, not to admit that they're wrong or there's a better way to do things. But I think people have to start to look around at the world we're in and say, we've never been sicker, particularly our kids, with all the health issues that are going on. So it's not crazy to say, hey, maybe everything that we've been taught about, all the different from pharma to food, we have to start making radical changes because we're radically sick and getting worse.
Exactly. And it's not just doctors who've been trained and have this belief and have potentially created harm for 20, 30 years to actually acknowledge that, as you say, to say, I'm sorry, to go through all those grieving processes. It's very, very big. But they're also held in this space by the regulators because they write the guidelines. And we've started to realize guidelines aren't guidelines. They are strict rule books.
Yeah.
And understanding, as I did through my deep dive in probably the next 18 months after Gary was reported, to understand that the Dietitians Association of Australia was accepting $23,000 a year from a group called the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturers Forum. And this group was made up of Kellogg's, Nestle, Sanitarium, and Freedom Foods. They were paying the Dietitians Association of Australia. So this is the accrediting body, the educating body, and the regulatory body of dietetics. And talking about our dietary guidelines, so this is affecting everybody. They were taking money from the cereal industry, and the specific documents they uncovered said it was to use dietitians, use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend cereal, grains, and sugars messaging. So they're not telling their dietitians that this is what they're doing. They're receiving this money and then using their dietitians through promotions like #cereal4brekkie and presenting research documents to their members that have got financial conflicts of interest and also, I believe, religious ideology, which you don't have to account for. You don't have to acknowledge that you hold a belief. It's only if you're getting money that you have to declare any conflict of interest. And I believe that dietetics was being educated by food, by pharma, and by religious ideology, and dietitians didn't know. And you can't blame them. This is what they've been taught.
Yes.
So it's huge, Alex. It really is. And obviously, pharmaceutical industry are being taught by pharma industry, and it's so incredible to look at the silos that people have been stuck in. I mean, Gary kept looking at me because I never went to university. As you know, when we met, I was a school photographer, and I was a nurse in my past life. So back in the day when you trained in the hospital system, so you did like a 6-week block of education, and then you were thrown onto the ward. We learnt by experience. We learnt by seeing things. Did it work? Did it not work? I wasn't isolated and siloed into this academic research space. And so when things just didn't make sense to me, I just kept diving down again, and Gary's going, what did you learn today? But, it took us 4.5 years. We finally got his name cleared. But that was just constantly putting out things. And in the end, I think they just couldn't cope with anymore. And we had to actually work on the process. We couldn't take, even though we believed it was totally criminal what they'd done, the medical board and the Dietetics Association working together and collaborating with this other man who was working for the cereal industry, working for Sanitarium, we couldn't say that what they decided was wrong, but we could go through the process finally. And that was all through my research, was able to pull that apart. And so, yes, he was cleared after 4.5 years. But they were going to take his medical license away. They never quite did it. They just silenced him from talking about nutrition.
Yes.
And the determination said, even if low carbohydrate, healthy fat principles and reducing sugar becomes accepted best practice, you can never talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it became so petty.
As always, it's follow the money, as you said. And if you go into the history of the Rockefellers and how they overtook the American Medical Association, and now it's more these big corporates that determine the guidelines, determine medical education. It's all about increasing profits every quarter. It's just a business. It's not about patient outcomes at all. And it's only, it only takes the smallest bit of common sense to say that, hey, we're not eating foods from nature and we're all getting sick. We're all eating these things in cereals and sugars and in these boxes wrapped in plastics. And now we've got all the fertilizers and all the stuff they're spraying on all these mass-produced carbohydrate crops and grains and stuff, and it's all just, once you see through the matrix, it's all just very clear why everyone's sick. But what do you want to talk about your journey of learning the history and maybe how this ties into some of the new stuff we're seeing with diets and blue zones and, again, money involved?
Yeah, I've been talking about a lot of things for a long time. I think I started public speaking in 2018, and I got a little bit... you just get a bit overwhelmed by it all, Alex. Like the space that you're in, like the space Gary's been in. And I think once you open your eyes to one thing, then you start to challenge and question more and more things. And And you just start to go, oh my gosh, this is just big. So we've got grandchildren now, and I just went, I'm just taking a little bit of time out here. But I think what triggered me to come back and start really doing another deep dive was the release of the Netflix documentary about the blue zones, How to Live to 100. And I had been looking into this since 2017. 2019, I started talking about it, and I've learned so much more in the last 6 months that I do believe it's really important. And I think, people who are on this channel who are questioning things, are they also questioning this plant-based messaging that we're getting over and over again? Are they questioning the demonization of animal protein and fats? And I think this is being healthy, having our brains fueled with healthy fuel is just so important moving forward. And so when I saw this documentary come out, I said to Gary, I'm sorry, I've got to get back in. I've got to start being loud again. And to me, the blue zones, and I'm not sure if many people have actually heard of it yet, but they may have heard of the Mediterranean diet. And the Mediterranean diet's been a big push in health professionals since we've started demonizing animal fats back in the 1970s with the McGovern report, fear fat, and now it's starting to become fear protein as well. And when you understand that the original blue zone that was found or discovered by Giovanni Pes and Michel Pulla, a demographer, they were looking at this tiny area in Sardinia and using a blue highlighter pen. And of course, it was such a tiny area that it became a blue zone when they circled it with a highlighter pen. And they were acknowledging that this area was 2,000 meters above sea level. And these people appeared to have exceptional longevity. Now, I'm going to use the word oldest olds, and we'll discuss that later. Were they centenarians? Were they supercentenarians? In my mind, this is not the absolute point of the blue zones, but when Dan Buettner came out doing his study with National Geographic, that was certainly an integral part of the discussion, was that they were centenarians and potentially supercentenarians. But let's just discuss the fact that they're oldest olds. And, what were they eating? And suddenly he's looked at Sardinia, he's gone to Okinawa to look at people there who they were doing a centenarian study from 1976, talking about these people who had exceptional longevity. And then he said that National Geographic wanted an American place because as you look at Okinawa, Sardinia, Ikaria, and Nicoya, when you look at it through an ancestral lens, you understand that they ate raw dairy. It might not have always been cattle, but sheep and goat milk are dairy, and they've made yogurts and cheeses from these products. They all ate pig, and they all used lard. And we're going back, if you go back through the centuries as well, lard is shelf stable. It doesn't need to be refrigerated. So it was something that you get 20 litres of lard from one pig that you could then use to cook. The vegetables, I'm not saying they didn't eat vegetables. I'm not saying they didn't have kitchen gardens, but they all tended animals, raised livestock in small numbers. And in this area in Sardinia, particularly, 65% of the land was owned by the community. So even the poorest poor could access all of these foods that I've just discussed. They could go and milk a goat. They could share in the slaughter of a pig. They could, it was about communal feeding. And I think that's what we're missing in our culture today. But so all of these ancestral diets, they all happened because of history. They were all involved in war. They were all involved in all these other things that pushed them into this space to eat this specific diet they were eating. And then how do you sell this to Americans who fear saturated fat, who fear, physical activity was part of their everyday living. It wasn't something they went off to the gym 5 o'clock to do a quick workout.
Yeah.
Probably some of them would have jumped into the gorge and had a nice cold swim on a morning like this morning.
Yeah.
But how do you sell this? And suddenly these oldest olds, I think their narrative has been erased. He's picked out certain bits that suit it, but the diet has all become the Loma Linda, which is the Seventh-day Adventist I guess, the heart of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the US. And instead of being somewhere that was places where people were born and raised through generations, and as I say, eating an ancestral diet that was available to them in that space, and it became the Seventh-day Adventist Church one, and Loma Linda was founded by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was a space that became a sanitarium, a bit like the Battle Creek Sanitarium. It became the College of Medical Evangelists, so they set up a university, or college originally, but it became a university. It was the heart of their food industry, where they developed food to take the place of flesh meat, eggs, milk and butter. So it was processed food. And I just kept thinking, how can all of this be a blue zone messaging? You know, where did we get this idea that it was plant-based? And some of the other public health messaging from some of these blue zones also doesn't suit a public health narrative in Australia or America, and where they would like to not necessarily recognise that these people drank wine that they made, and a lot of them smoked, which isn't a great public health message, and I'm not condoning that in any way. But the narrative has been so sterilised, and it's becoming socially engineered to just be this plant-based messaging. And I just have to talk about it, Alex.
Yeah, it's become branded, and as you say, they're really trying to demonize meat, animal fats, and protein. Sometimes it's under this guise of climate change, and other times there's other messaging or whatever. But the fact is that our bodies are amino acid producing machines. Every cell in our body has cholesterol in it. If you think about what humans did in nature for thousands of years, what was the richest source of calories? You're not going to walk out there and find farms, and we might get into the history of how agriculture began and farming and that type of thing, but you're going to find protein. We were hunter-gatherers, and maybe some berries and some vegetables and nuts and stuff here and there. But if you're starving out in the bush, you want someone to catch you a fish or a large animal and cook it up to survive. So do you want to go down that rabbit hole a bit, Belinda? Maybe the history of agriculture and how that ties into religion?
We can go down the history of agriculture, and definitely once farming started, I think George Melligus made the comment that agriculture really harmed humanity because we got sicker and shorter over time. But I think where I'd really love to go is about Weston A. Price, and you may be familiar with his work in the 1930s. And again, he's looking at agriculture had started, obviously not in Australia, but in some of these areas that he went to, not all of them, he examined 14 different cultures around the world. He was a dentist in the 1930s in America, looking at the fact that his patients were developing an incredible amount of dental caries. Their jaws over 1 or 2 generations were starting to narrow. People couldn't fit their wisdom teeth in. And his hypothesis was something has changed dramatically in the diet with industrialization. So yeah, we've had the agricultural revolution, but with industrialization, when foods started to become processed, highly processed, when they could process white sugar and white flour, he thought that was the turning point when it started to really impact people's health. And before that, I'm not saying there weren't communicable diseases that killed a lot of people, but the non-communicable disease really started after the Industrial Revolution.
And just on that with the jaw and the crowding of the teeth and that, what you're saying is that you look at these places out in Africa where they're just eating animals all the time, and all these people that live in dirts and huts have got perfectly straight teeth, big, healthy, strong jaws, and it's from that chewing of meat rather than just in the
chewing of meat. But he also looked at people. So he had looked at the Inuit in Alaska, but he did look at South Pacific Islanders, and they didn't have a lot of meat. They still had meat. I'm not saying they didn't. They had fish, but the diets. He looked at our First Nations people here in Australia. He looked all over the world, and he actually felt that the First Nations group that he found here that had been untouched by westernization and white man and white man's food He thought they had the most beautiful jawlines, minimal dental caries in all of these different places. And some of them were fermenting vegetables. They were fermenting sourdough breads. They were, so it's, say, not no flour, not no things, but all of it was done with care. They were reducing the irritants of these plants through fermenting and the processes that cooked them and the processes they had worked out. Again, would resource people, would nourish people and resource the next generation, Alex, which we're seeing today is just getting really hard to resource. So the things that he found when he actually examined all of the different foods, because their diet was so diverse, but when he examined them, he found they had a very, very high amount of vitamin A, D, and K2. It didn't matter what they were eating, whether it was shellfish, whether it was pork and lard, whether it was insects, incredible amount. And I think what I've just heard over and over again with the researchers here in Australia who talk about our Indigenous population survived on a low-fat diet because kangaroos are lean meat. Well, Weston A. Price found that their vitamin A, D, and K2 was 10 times the amount of the diet of people in America at the time who were eating pork and beef and sheep, lamb. So it's how it was packaged. It wasn't considered a fatty diet, but an emu has this tiny little back fat, base of its neck on the just tiny, and you only need 2.5 nanograms of that compared to 15 nanograms of a pig fat to get the same amount of vitamin K2. So I suggest in my research that this was liquid gold, and it was all about having those essential fatty acids in their diet. That was the only thing he found in common everywhere. It didn't matter whether they ate a lot more plants, they had a lot more fruit, they had a lot more meat, they had a lot more fat, blah, blah, whatever it was. These were the elements that he uncovered, went across all of them. And this is what we're being now taught to fear and not have in our diet.
And the biochemistry behind that, do you think that's because they are eating straight from nature, plants or insects or whatever, whereas let's say industrial farming, or even of animals, are now being fed, grain and
Exactly. There was no industrial farming. There were no fertilizers. They were using animals to fertilize the ground. Like it was that circle of life. It was going back to resourcing the soil, resourcing humans, resourcing to rebirth. It was a closed circuit that didn't require any inputs from chemicals or it was massive. And I think his work just needs to really be promoted because I believe he's showing that even since the agricultural revolution, if you are accessing resources that are close to you, and again, we grow up in the latitude that we're based in with the foods that we can locally access. So if you live in the tropics and you've got access to food all the time, you can metabolize your fructose. Gary has really delved into this in a big way because you've got vitamin D that will help that metabolism all year round. Whereas here in Tasmania, in the middle of winter, when we have not a lot of sun, we should not be eating a whole lot of fruit because we can't metabolize it.
Yeah,
it just makes sense.
It does make sense once you understand that biochemistry. And then on the flip side, if people are getting sick in winter because, we now know about sugar and its impact on the immune system and inflammation, these flow-on effects. So it kind of, once you see through the matrix of this normalization, it's not really normal for humans to get sick like all the time, like people are getting sick these days.
Yeah. That's a really good point about winter. Everyone gets sick in winter, but yes, they're still eating the same diet and not getting outside, not getting the sun, not getting your circadian rhythms are all out because you sit in front of TV and have blue light all the time. It's really interesting.
Do you want to continue down this path in any certain direction, or do you want to maybe talk about how seed oils and that side of things have come in to corrupt, the demonization of animal fats as well, or where do you want to go next?
Yeah. Oh, I can go lots of places. I think seed oils are harmful. And Peter Bruckner asked me the other day, he said, what do they do? And I thought, they inflame the body. I said, you're a doctor, you tell me. I guess I look more at the people who are calling out things. Like, my research has really revolved around the vested interests and the religious ideology shaping this messaging. But there was a guy called Fred Kummerow in the 1950s when seed oils were starting to be developed. They started in 1910. So we're going back to Crisco. Of course, Thomas Edison develops electricity, and you don't need whale oil anymore, and you don't need the other oils that Procter & Gamble were making. And they suddenly started to look at their fat that they were making and went, it actually looks like lard. So with a bit more processing and a bit more refining, first of all, they started to sell it as a margarine sort of replacement for lard.
Yeah.
And that really suited Judaism, because in that religion, they're not allowed to eat meat and dairy in the same meal. It's not that they're not allowed to eat meat or dairy, but not in the same meal. They're not allowed to be prepared in the same space. So suddenly Crisco that was developed, and this is part of the Israeli paradox and the French paradox. The Israeli paradox, there's so much heart disease with Jewish people and so little with French, who eat a lot of butter and a lot of animal fat, a lot of cheese. The Israelis really started to embrace Crisco because it suited, they could start to cook all their things without actually using an animal fat. And as time went on, so Fred Kummerow in the 1950s just said to the AMA, I truly believe that it's seed oils that are causing heart disease. And that didn't suit the narrative that was coming out, I believe, so the College of Medical Evangelists, which was founded by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there was a guy called Mervyn Harding, and a lot of the research that some of these people have done within that church, and you can hold a belief, but you can't hold a fact. And so you can continue holding those beliefs and defending those beliefs, but if there's a fact, and sorry, I'm jumping around, but like white swans, there were only ever white swans in Europe. When they came to Australia and they found a black swan, they had to go, oh, well, there's a black swan now. They had to accept. You only need one black swan. As Gary said, you only need one person in your practice to improve by doing something different to say, well, this could be an option. Yeah. This is the fact that I'm seeing. And so Fred Kummerow was saying, this really is a problem. But from the College of Medical Evangelists, they wanted to prove, not disprove, divine inspiration. And so here I just need to acknowledge that the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was a woman named Ellen G. White. And she had over 2,000 visions and dreams from God in her lifetime. And in 1863, she had a vision from God telling her that flesh meat defiled not only men, but women and children. And it should not be served, certainly not to any child, but it was just a toxic stimulant. And then she went on to say also any product from an animal was similarly toxic. And because the church was built on her beliefs, she taught the church this idea about medical evangelism being the right arm of the church, and their health reform message that we should be eating fruit, nuts and seeds, which was found in the Garden of Eden in Genesis, that was the God-appointed diet for man. They have, honestly, Alex, since then been heartfelt. They've done it for their salvation. They've done it because they truly believe that this is true. And their research has been done to prove, not disprove, divine inspiration. So when Mervyn Harding went to Fred Stair in the 1950s to have his doctoral thesis, actually 1940s, 50s, doctoral thesis on proving that vegetarianism was healthy. And they called it vegetarianism because veganism wasn't coined until 1944. And I don't believe it could actually be a diet, because all the way back through history, even the strictest religions, nobody could stop people from having at least yak milk and ghee in their diet, because that's how they were able to get those essential fatty acids that we've talked about. So nowhere in history has any group that have survived completely avoided animal protein and fat in some way, until the Seventh-day Adventist Church were able to invent foods that would take the place of these things. And so he wanted to do this doctoral dissertation with Fred Stair, but Fred Stair worked at Harvard University, and he was being funded by the food industry to prove that sugar was bad. And so Mervyn Harding wanted to prove that animal protein and fat was bad, and that suited Fred Astaire as well, because if they demonize that, they can promote a plant-based diet, they can promote processed food, they can promote, Fred Astaire was protecting sugar. And so it just really suited, and they took that doctoral dissertation through to the American Dietetics Association, through to the McGovern report, and it's just gone on from there. Fred Kummerow just tried really hard, but because this, I would say, religious ideology and vested interest from corporate food and pharmaceutical industry were very, very vocal and really had the ear of the McGovern report in lots of ways, and I won't go into all of that because it's very complicated. But Fred Kummerow lost his funding. But the university said, you can have a back room and you can keep doing research. Anyway, he was in his 90s when he decided he would sue the American government for not listening to him. And finally, when he was 102, the government finally agreed that trans fats were dangerous to health. And we're talking about not naturally occurring trans fats, but artificial trans fats that were part of making up this lard, this Crisco in the beginning.
Yes.
And they've now been banned in the US, but they're still not banned here in Australia.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, I often talk about a lot of these products and pesticides and whatever that are banned in Europe that are still in America, but sometimes we forget it's even worse here. And I talk often about how I think Australia is just like a test bed for rolling out all these agendas and seeing how strict they can get things and mind controlling people into the matrix.
Yeah, you have to wonder. You just go, why, if it's been banned in different places, you say other things as well, why are we still being experimented on here in Australia? And I guess this is why I've just become loud, because everything just keeps coming back to these essential fatty acids, to biochemistry, to ancestral diets, and acknowledging that this is so important for our health. And maybe taking all these things away are going to help us get out of the matrix, dumb us down, make us follow the rules and the regulations. This is challenging sovereignty.
Yeah.
If we're awake and we can think clearly with our brains.
Absolutely. I think it's all people are starting to realize that, having, your diet and your health, it all ties into that mental health and being able to actually think critically. And as you say, everything we're trying to do now is teach people how to become self-sovereign and less reliant on the system. But maybe just to play devil's advocate for the people that are vegetarians out there, I guess the thing for me is that you need to supplement with B12 a lot of the time. And so what is, I guess, the sort of counter arguments that people put forward? I don't mind if people they don't want to harm animals, but again, if you really think about it, I believe that plants also are obviously alive and conscious, or mushrooms or anything is all alive. So what are some of maybe the better counter arguments you've heard, and what are your thoughts about them and that type of thing when it comes to vegetarianism and these different
I think there's some really interesting conversations happening. I would highly recommend people look at Leah Keith's work. She was a vegan for ethical reasons, a passionate vegan, and had been for decades, and got sick and started to realize that there is no life without death, even as a vegan. With the monocropping and all the other things, microorganisms, our soil cannot survive without microorganisms. And if we're killing all of those when we're cropping and tilling and fertilizing with artificial fertilizers, then that is death to the circle of life. Then the animals
and the
that are
bugs
feeding,
and everything, yes.
get harmed. Like it's a perpetual thing. So I think her work is just brilliant. And there's also an ex-vegan called Denise Minger, who has written some beautiful things and really supportive of people still wanting to make a choice to eat a specific way. And I think Kate Kavanagh, she was a vegan as well. She's started her own regenerative farm and she raises animals ethically. I think if you really want to follow this and look a little bit more deeply, some of these people are beautiful to follow because they've still got that heart in that space. They're still very aligned with the messaging and they want to do the right thing by the animals, by the plants, by the planet, to maintain health. And Kate Kavanagh in particular talks about the circle of life and how we go back into the dirt. Animals go back, they replenish, they produce the carbon, then come back, and it's this circle. And she talks about nourishing women in particular through food, and discusses how many women are now struggling with polycystic ovary syndrome, with difficulty getting pregnant. In this particular day and age, it's getting massive, Alex, and so much intervention, and pregnancy is becoming so medicalized. And she talks about it. When she came away from being a vegan and started to eat animal protein and fat, then she decided she had to have her own farm. And she's in America. And she said when she saw her pig eat 3 of the 7 piglets, she nearly died. She just thought, well, how can this even be happening? How can a mother eat a baby? I'm not suggesting we eat our babies. But she said she realized that unless a mother is resourced enough, she couldn't grow the other 4 babies. And she talks about this circle of life and believes that we fear death now. We fear death of an animal. We fear death ourselves because we've made time linear. And suddenly there's nothing at the end. You drop off into an abyss. And if you go back to really, again, ancestral way of thinking, the circle of life, it's about resourcing constantly in a circular motion. And I think it's a really great way to think about life. And I try as much as I can to support fresh, seasonal, local food, local growers, and people who are doing the right thing by their animals. Again, looking at this ancestral diet, looking back at these people in Sardinia, Ikaria, Okinawa, and Nicoya, they weren't raising animals in captivity. And okay, people in New York may not have that luxury. Things have changed. There's a lot of people, and so I realise I might be talking as someone who's very privileged here in Tasmania to be able to access this sort of food, which we can. We are so lucky here in Tasmania. But these people in these blue zones were raising animals individually, and I don't believe the issues of animals being diseased came about until we started putting them really close together. I'm not talking about the agricultural revolution where they started to domesticate animals, but I'm talking about when they started to really domesticate them and put them into very confined places. And then, trichinosis and anthrax and brucellosis and all of those diseases started affecting animals. And so then people had that fear. Were animals diseased? And then you've come we're in the temperance movement in the 1800s, were animals causing us to become criminals? And again, industrialization was bringing a lot of people who lived on farms and were self-sufficient suddenly into cities. And there were criminal behaviours happening now because they didn't have enough food, or they weren't getting enough money, or there was the ability to go to a pub and have alcohol, or then they took away the alcohol, the prohibitions, and they gave people sugar to calm them down. It's when all the ice cream bars and the Coca-Cola took off. So it's people. We've got to understand it's people making all these problems. It's not the animals. It's not the planet. It's not Mother Nature.
Yeah, well, it's a certain group of people, as we've been covering in our Evil Elite series, getting to the bottom of all this. But that piglet example you gave is brutal. But I think people forget that Mother Nature is brutal, but it is for a reason, as you say. The survival of the fittest in nature, it actually... it allows the strongest to survive with the best immune systems and the best genetics and so on. Whereas look at the way that modern culture has gone and everything that's happening as a result, and then how much we're spending on people that are sick now. And interesting about all the animals being raised so domestically and all the chickens cooped in, and they're not getting the healthy soil and bugs and germs, just like our children now aren't getting that, and their immune systems are shot, and then they're being fed those grains that are covered in pesticides as their diet, and that all goes in energetically and into that meat and into that animal, that then we consume that flesh and then we're getting sick. So I think it's just all connected once you
Except our children are being told not to eat animals anymore either. So just quickly, I want to butt in for one sec, Alex. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church have this devout belief, and they have been involved in doing the algorithms for the Health Star rating. So, of course, anything that aligns with their messaging is getting 5 stars, like Up and Go, and anything that has got real milk is 3. You've got to start to understand where this messaging is really impacting things. But Sanitarium has now paid for the right to provide the nutrition arm of life education. And I don't know if your audience has got kids in primary school years yet, but Healthy Harold is part of this life education and goes around and traditionally has been doing drug and sex education to schools. And now that the Seventh-day Adventist Church have bought in to provide the nutrition arm, they are now teaching a generation of children to fear animal protein and fat in the school place. And the resources that go to the parents and to the teachers from this initiative is demonizing animal protein and fat, which is what we're trying to talk about here. And my question is, where's the transparency that this is coming from a church ideology, not from a health perspective? And if we're, like you've talked about, if we're taking away healthy fats from our children and the cholesterol that they need for their brains to work, where are we sending our children in this messaging to by the time they get to high school? They're so dumbed down. I don't know if you were the same, but I remember when Kate came home from school, she'd say, oh my gosh, we learnt this at school today. We need to start, cutting the rings off the bottle caps because it could harm a bird if it gets into the oceans and things. So we diligently started doing that. William came home and, said another thing. Well, kids in primary school now potentially going to start coming home and say, we should not be eating meat. And this is being taught to them from a commercial arm of a church. And I say commercial because they are profiting from us also not eating meat. Like it's a bit tricky.
Well, you can go down so many rabbit holes here with Big Brother separating the family unit to start indoctrinating kids at a younger and younger age. Everything from some of the, the gender ideologies that are now being pushed in schools to, as you say, the diet. And it's all just part of this big agenda to keep everyone dumbed down and sick and unhealthy and not figure out what's going on.
I think it is. I really do.
As they want to domesticate, just like all the chickens in the coops now that are getting sick, look at the cities where everyone's domesticated and they're so reliant on the system that there's kind of no escaping the matrix now for most people. And that's what we're trying to tell people. It's like it's time to start thinking about making changes in your life to maybe move out of cities if this is going to keep getting worse and going down this path. Because, who do you want teaching your kids and feeding your kids and telling them
and you would have had that conversation with Gary about feedlot people in cities.
Absolutely.
Accessing processed food, because if they demonize everything that's in nature, if they start to say, eat this, it's processed, it's fortified, it's got the supplements in it that you need, just to go, oh. Anyway, the blue zones have now chosen Singapore as the latest blue zone. I forgot to mention, the church have bought the Blue Zones project, the rights to be able to run this program. And so since they've bought it in 2020, the wine at 5 has dropped down to Friends at 5 because they're also anti-alcohol. But I think this messaging of anti-animal protein and fats is getting stronger and stronger, and it makes complete sense when you realise the church own it. But they've now named Singapore as a Blue Zone 2.0, socially engineered blue zone. And this isn't holding the elders at all. Have you been to Singapore? We have. And the elders, there's no pension, there's no social security in the same way there is in Sardinia and Icaria and Nicoya and Costa Rica. They have a social security thing. And potentially there's been some pension fraud, which Saul Newman highlighted in 2019. He was an academic in Canberra. And he started to challenge why were so many people, centenarians and super centenarians, in these areas that Dan Buettner was uncovering and they were looking at, and the idea that documents had been manipulated or whatever else. And they went through in Japan not long after. In 2010, they realised 238,000 centenarians had actually died and their families were getting the money. So, pension fraud is a big thing. That's why I've used the term oldest olds, because they are the oldest olds in those areas, and that's how they are living, that they were described. But in Singapore, they don't have the same pension and social security that they do here in Australia and other places. And the oldest olds often have to keep working. Like when we went, we saw people in their 80s working at McDonald's. Like here, 14-year-olds work at McDonald's. And I'm not saying, there's not older people, obviously, in more senior roles. But in Singapore, the people who are cleaning tables and who are serving at the counter and cleaning streets and collecting cardboard boxes are people in their 80s and 90s, because they don't have that social security support. And yet we're being told that it's this amazing place of health and wellness. It's because they're taxing sugar and they're taxing cigarettes and they're creating bike paths and they're reducing the amount of cars that can go into these places. But they're not really acknowledging the elderly at all, which was the whole point of this blue zone, was longevity. And when Dan Buettner went and he wrote it in an article that I saw, and he went and spoke to a woman who was a geriatrician in one of the major hospitals, and she said, yes, we're starting to get this incredible longevity. Our numbers are up to 80. I think she said people are starting to live to 89.4 years. Unfortunately, and he printed this, for 14 years for women and up to 10 years for men, they're living with heart disease, diabetes, kidney disease. You just go, that's not living.
Yeah.
And yet the people in Sardinia that we talk about, they were living. They were still walking up and down hills. They were still tending their kitchen gardens. Socially engineering this blue zone. It is coming to Australia. We're going to start to be told that the blue zone is the way to live. But I believe it's the socially engineered, elders erased narrative. Yeah. And I've listened to Tim Crow, Joanna McMillan, and Susie Burrell, who are also all very high up as spokespeople for the Dietitians Association. They changed their name after we called them out for the money they were receiving from food industry, and they changed their name. But these are spokespeople for the Dietitians Association, and they're now talking about we need to be having the Blue Zones diet. It's coming here, and the more people who can be aware that this is going to start to become socially engineered, as in they're going to start making sure schools aren't serving meats. They're taking it out of hospitals. In New Zealand, they're already doing it, taking it out of, you've got to have more plant-based foods in restaurants. You need to have all this buy-in. And Kate's a change management consultant. I found some documents for the Blue Zones where they were charging $6.5 million US for people to have their city become a Blue Zone accredited city. So it would be like saying, all right, Launceston, we're going to be Blue Zone. But then you've got to keep paying for accreditation every year, and you have to align with their socially engineered template. And surely it doesn't cost $6.5 million to give people information. I spoke to a guy the other day online, and he said just to have a 1-hour meeting with one of the speakers from the Blue Zones, I won't mention names, it cost them $5,000 for listening to a PowerPoint presentation that was all prepackaged, and then he went away, answered a few questions and left. This is
where the money goes into the propaganda.
We're being sold a program, and people are buying into it because they are listening to all this messaging. As you say, Alex, we're just being told that this is the right thing and we have to do it for people and planetary health. And I challenge that from where that messaging is coming, as you and I would both know. It's World Economic Forum, and it's far bigger than what we believe.
World Health Organization and all that type of thing. Yeah, so many questions, isn't it, about if people do what they're being told to do in the Matrix and then you work to 65, you're going to be so sick that you can't really enjoy retirement or anything. Having a purpose and something to do every day is a big part of life, as you say, for those people that still have hobbies or still work later into life.
Yes.
But then if you are sick and then you become reliant on the government again. This is what they want, everyone trapped in this system. And as you say, all this money that gets pumped into these things that we're discovering the fraud through, USAID, and people are waking up to all these non-government organisations that sit above the law. It was really sad to see Australia sign on to that new World Health Organization treaty last week and hand over all the decision-making policies about health for the next pandemic or whatever they may be planning. And so it's just these channels that people think are the people that they should be trusting, the doctors or the teachers or the news. But I'm hoping, I know our audience is awake, that people are realizing that everything that these people have been taught is just this propaganda indoctrination to keep everyone dumbed down and enslaved.
It's institutionalization, don't you think?
Yes, 100%.
It's pulling us all into this space. And whether the messaging is coming from school, from university, or from media, health professionals, it's becoming a single narrative that's dumbing us down. And yes, we need to, I think platforms like yours are fantastic because we're starting to reach people and understanding that it's a really broad message that we need to be talking. The narrative is much bigger than just Bitcoin. Bitcoin's going to give you some financial freedom, but if you've not got your health, then it's not going to help either. So this is, I'm so excited and so proud of you for going into a really broad discussion in this space. So well done you.
Oh, thanks. And I think it's a deep philosophical discussion about, well, what does it mean to be human and the point of life? Do we really want to be here and be, in debt and then be sick and then retire and be unhealthy and after paying taxes our whole life and barely being able to now afford somewhere to live and good quality food? Like, what is the point to all this system that is getting worse and worse for 99% every year? We need a new system and a new way of thinking about life. And that's the scariest thing. How many people now, if the power went out for 3 days in cities like Melbourne or New York, like just the absolute chaos that would unfold, how far how far away from being in touch with nature and our friends and community and everything else have people become? That's the scariest part for me.
It's a really, really scary part. And I think even understanding what happened with the COVID lockdowns and everything else, we were very lucky again here in Tasmania. We just pulled up the drawbridge and left the mainland.
Yeah.
I think I spoke to you that I had done some research into, had all this happened before, where has this concept come from? And looking back to the Spanish flu, back from World War I, when people returned to Australia from Europe, they had to come via Tasmania. We were the quarantine island, unless you came via Darwin or Tassie. Tassie was the main one. And people were here until they made sure that they were clear and safe to travel back. And there's pictures of women in these amazing long dresses and these cinched waists and parasols in their hand and face masks going out for a walk. And the idea that you had to be separated from people was even back then, like that, they were the restrictions that came through. But the funniest thing I think that came out of that was these returning soldiers were not going to be taken away from their beer. So what they decided to do for publicans was they were only allowed to have 3 minutes. They were allowed to run in 3 minutes and get out again, and that's where sculling of beer came about. So I think the moral gymnastics of people living in different societies and how they evolve. But I didn't see that with COVID. Like in Melbourne especially, it just imploded. It was so strict, and I'm so glad we lived in Tasmania. And Kate came home with a baby, with a toddler and a baby in her belly, and they got to be here in the fresh air. And I mean, you can't invite everybody here, but you wish you could, just to see what it's like, because I can't imagine being so confined and so fearful. And when you are confined and people around you are scared, it grows. It becomes even bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so many people have woken up since COVID and just how deep the brainwashing ran, how angry people were and police body slamming people if their mask wasn't on right. And just all this stuff that even, I think this week they've repealed the COVID vax for people under 18, saying the risks outweigh the benefits and all this stuff.
It wasn't this week. It was actually in 2022, but they never announced it. Marianne DeMarcy's uncovered it and written this article on Substack and said, oh my gosh, I've just realised in 2022 they repealed it. They don't want to make a big thing of it. They want to keep this just slowly quiet. And it's the same with the diabetes. So therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, which Gary's been pushing for I would say, a decade, has finally been approved and put into the national strategy for diabetes management, but there was no song and dance about it, and it had to come from endocrinologists. It couldn't possibly come from an orthopedic surgeon and an ophthalmologist and the other people and the dietitians who were working in this space. So, it has to be their idea, and it has to be quiet, and it can't be a big thing, because that, again, going back to that grief, you're going back to people challenging their beliefs, you're going back to financial interests, but I think hugely grief. How do you say I'm sorry? How do you say I've actually done the wrong thing? It slips in very quietly.
Yeah.
But it was 2022, Marianne found that they
interesting.
actually
Is that
said
in
it
Australia you're talking
18.
about, or in the US in the 2022?
In Australia.
Okay.
The TGA.
Okay.
In Australia. And so if it happened in Australia in 2022, why weren't the public told? Why weren't people told that they didn't have to vaccinate their children? Why wasn't it a big song and dance?
Well, I think it was the opposite.
GPs would still be doing it. It's been put into a guideline, but not put out publicly, and I don't believe a lot of people knew about it.
Yeah, and if that's the case, that's still been pushed by the media, and even schools. I've seen newsletters of telling your kids to be up to date and all this sort of stuff, which is literally against the guidelines with what you're saying.
It went in 2022, Alex.
Yeah. So, Belinda, it's been amazing. Is there any other topics you wanted to touch on today before we wrap up?
I think we've jumped into lots, and you people are going, what a crazy lady.
Amazing. Well, I'll put links down below to follow Belinda, Gary, and all their amazing work that they do. But we'll have to have you on again in future as you uncover more, which I'm sure you will, Belinda. So thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Alex. I've really enjoyed it. Much appreciated.
Cheers, guys. Bye.